The meeting was called for 11 o'clock at night, not the next morning, not after the weekend, not at a time that would have allowed the people being summoned to prepare themselves or to think about what was coming or to consult with each other before they arrived. 11 o'clock at night, on a Tuesday in the spring of 1974, with 2 hours' notice. The inner circle members who received the summons described, in accounts gathered across the following decades, the same quality of feeling when the message arrived. Not surprise, exactly, because late-night summons were part of the texture of life in People's Temple by 1974. Something else, a quality of the summons that was different from the usual late-night calls, a weight to it, the kind of weight that a message carries when the person sending it has already made a decision and is calling you not to consult you but to inform you. They came, they always came, and what Jim Jones told them in that room, at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night in the spring of 1974, set in motion a sequence of events that would end, 4.5 years later, with 918 people dead in a jungle in South America. He told them they were going to Guyana, not visiting, not exploring, going, permanently, the entire community. Every member, every program, every organizational structure that People's Temple had built across 9 years in California, all of it, relocated to a tract of leased land in the northwest of Guyana, in a jungle clearing that Jones described, in the language he used for everything that required the congregation's acceptance, as the fulfillment of a vision. The agricultural mission, the socialist utopia, the place where the community could finally live according to its principles without the interference of a racist, capitalist society that had never wanted it to succeed. He spoke for 2 hours. The inner circle listened. And when he finished, the room was quiet in a way that the inner circle members who survived describe, in their separate accounts, with the same word. Not the charged quiet of a room that has been moved, the quiet of a room that has been stunned, the quiet of people who have understood something and do not yet know what to do with the understanding. If you have ever been in a room when a decision was announced that you knew, in that moment, was going to change everything, subscribe right now and hit the bell. Because what happened in that room on that Tuesday night in 1974 is the hinge point of the entire Jonestown story. Before that night, Jonestown was still a possibility. After it, Jonestown was already, in some sense, inevitable. Go back further. Go back to what produced the decision. Because the Tuesday night meeting was not where the decision was made, it was where the decision was announced. The decision had been made earlier. How much earlier, and in what circumstances, and with what degree of deliberation, is the question that the accounts of that period cannot fully answer. What they can answer is why. Why Guyana? Why 1974? Why the announcement came at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night with 2 hours' notice to the people who would be most responsible for executing it. The why, assembled from the accounts of inner circle members and from the documentary record of People's Temple's situation in 1974, produces a picture that is more specific and more contingent than the accounts of Jonestown usually suggest. The move to Guyana was not inevitable. It was a response to a specific set of pressures that had been building since the early 1970s and that had reached, by the spring of 1974, a point where Jones believed, or had decided to act as if he believed, that California was no longer safe. The pressures were real and they were also, in the way that Jones experienced everything by 1974, amplified by the pharmaceutical management that was altering his perception of threat. The New West investigation was not yet public, that would come in 1977, but the journalistic interest that would produce it was already beginning. Former members had been speaking to reporters. There were questions being asked that had not been asked before. The political protection that Jones had built so carefully, the wall of legitimacy constructed from endorsements and photographs and volunteer labor, was not yet crumbling but had begun, in small ways, to show stress. And Jones, whose hypervigilant social cognition had been refined over 20 years into an instrument of extraordinary precision, was reading those stresses with an accuracy that the people around him could not match and a paranoid distortion that was, by 1974, beginning to color what the accuracy produced. He saw what was real. He also saw what was not real. And by 1974, the pharmaceutical management of the disorder that produced the non-real perceptions had not yet reached the level of degradation it would reach in Guyana, which meant that the two things, the real perception and the distorted perception, were still producing, together, something that resembled coherent strategic thought. Guyana was coherent strategic thought. It was also paranoid flight. It was both of those things simultaneously, in proportions that no one in the inner circle could accurately assess at the time and that the historical record has not been able to fully separate since. The inner circle member who has spoken most extensively about the Tuesday night meeting, a man named David Garrison who left People's Temple in 1976, 2 years after the announcement, and who spent the following years in the particular purgatory of someone who got out before the end and has spent every year since asking whether getting out was the same as having done enough, described what happened in the room after Jones finished speaking. He said the first person to speak was a woman named Carol, a senior administrative member whose name appears throughout the People's Temple records and who died in Jonestown. Carol said, quietly, into the silence, "How long have you been planning this?" Jones looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Long enough to know it is right." Carol nodded slowly. She did not ask a follow-up question. No one did. Garrison said, "That was the thing I have thought about most in the years since." Not Jones's answer. Carol's nod. Because Carol was one of the most analytically rigorous people in the organization. She had run programs, managed budgets, identified problems before they became crises. She was not credulous. She was not the kind of person who accepted things without scrutiny. And she heard Jones say long enough to know it is right, and she nodded and did not ask another question. And I watched her do it, and I did not ask a question either. None of us did. And I have spent 30 years trying to understand why. The answer Garrison eventually arrived at, the answer he described to the researcher who spent 3 years interviewing him in the late 1980s, is not the answer that most accounts of Jonestown suggest. It is not that the inner circle was manipulated into silence, though manipulation was present. It is not that they were afraid to ask questions, though fear was present. It is that the question Carol had asked, "How long have you been planning this?" was the only question that mattered, and Jones's answer had closed it. Long enough to know it is right. The answer told them that the decision was made, that there was no version of this conversation in which the inner circle's input changed the outcome, that what they were being offered was not consultation but notification, and that understanding, the understanding of a room full of people who had been in proximity to Jones long enough to know the difference between being consulted and being notified, produced the quiet. Not agreement, not acceptance. The recognition that the decision was already complete and that the question of whether they agreed with it was not the operative question. The operative question was what they were going to do now that it was made. And in the room, on that Tuesday night, with Jones watching them in the jungle in Guyana already waiting even though none of them had seen it yet, that question had only one answer: that the architecture of their lives inside People's Temple made available to them. They were going to help make it happen. What Garrison could not explain, what he described as the thing he had been unable to reach in 30 years of thinking about it, was the moment between Carol's nod and his own silence. The moment when he had felt something that he could not categorize as either agreement or capitulation. Something that was, in the moment of feeling it, more like relief. The relief of a decision being made. The relief of the uncertainty that had been building about where People's Temple was going, about what the pressures of the political climate meant, about whether the thing they had built could survive in California, being resolved. Not resolved well, not resolved in the way he would have chosen, but resolved. The decision was made. The direction was set. And in the relief of direction, the question of whether the direction was right became, temporarily, less urgent than the fact of its existence. Garrison said, "I think that is how Jones made most of his major decisions work. Not by persuading people they were right, by making the relief of decision feel like agreement with the decision. By the time anyone examined whether they actually agreed, the logistics were already underway and examining it felt less like wisdom and more like obstruction." He was very good at that. At the space between announcement and examination. At filling that space with movement so that examination never found a moment to sit down. The logistics began the following morning. Garrison was one of the people tasked with the advance work, identifying what the Guyana agricultural mission would require, coordinating with the Guyanese government, beginning the process of moving an organization of hundreds of people across an international border to a jungle clearing that most of them had never heard of 48 hours earlier. He described the work as consuming in a way that he now understands was not incidental. The consumption was the point. Every hour spent on logistics was an hour not spent on the question that Carol's nod had foreclosed. The work produced its own momentum, its own necessity, its own claim on everyone's attention and energy and commitment. By the time anyone might have paused to ask whether the decision had been right, they were too far into the execution of it for pausing to feel like anything other than abandonment. Garrison said, "I think I understood, at some level, that the work was designed that way, that the pace of execution was not accidental, but understanding it and being able to stop it were different things. I was inside it. The understanding was something I could hold in one hand while I kept working with the other, which is not, I have come to believe, the same as understanding at all." 3 members of the inner circle who were present at the Tuesday night meeting left People's Temple in the 2 years that followed the announcement. Garrison was one of them. The other two have not spoken publicly. The remaining members of the inner circle who were present that night stayed through the move to Guyana and died in Jonestown. Carol, who asked the only question worth asking and then nodded and did not ask another, died in Jonestown. Her name is in the archive. Her question is in Garrison's account. Long enough to know it is right. Jones's answer to the only question worth asking, and Carol's nod, which Garrison has spent 30 years trying to understand, which was not agreement and was not capitulation and was something in between that the language of manipulation and the language of compliance do not adequately capture. The nod of a person who understood that the decision was made and that the question of whether it was right was not the operative question and who chose, in that understanding, to stay, to help make it happen, to put her analytical rigor in the service of a direction she had not chosen and had not been asked to choose. Because the alternative, the examination that the logistics would not leave time for, the question that would have required stopping the momentum was something that the architecture of 11 years inside People's Temple had made, for Carol, structurally unavailable. Not impossible, unavailable. The distinction is the whole story. It is the story of everyone who stayed, everyone who nodded, everyone who helped make it happen. The jungle was waiting, the decision was made, and in the room, at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night in the spring of 1974, the quiet that followed was not the quiet of people who had been convinced. It was the quiet of people who had understood that convincing was not what was happening, and who stayed anyway, because the before, the life outside the architecture, the life in which the question of whether the direction was right could be asked and examined and answered, was further away, by 1974, than the jungle. The researcher who spent 3 years interviewing Garrison published his findings in 1992, in a paper that examined the decision-making dynamics of the People's Temple inner circle in the period between 1974 and 1978. The paper is careful and precise and arrives, in its conclusion, at a formulation that Garrison read when the paper was published and that he told the researcher, in a letter, was the most accurate description of his experience he had ever encountered. The formulation is this: the inner circle members who remained after the Guyana announcement were not people who had been persuaded that the decision was right. They were people for whom the cost of examining whether it was right had become, by the time the announcement was made, higher than the cost of executing it. This is not compliance. It is not manipulation in the simple sense. It is the product of a specific architecture, an architecture built over years, deliberately, to ensure that by the time a decision of this magnitude was made, the capacity to examine it had been sufficiently eroded that examination felt less like wisdom and more like betrayal. Jones did not convince the inner circle that Guyana was right. He built, over years, a structure in which the question of whether Guyana was right could not be asked at the moment it mattered. Carol's nod was not agreement. It was the recognition of a person inside a structure that had made agreement and non-agreement equally beside the point. Garrison wrote back to the researcher after reading the paper. His letter is in the archive. In it he says, "That is accurate. I want you to know that I have spent 18 years trying to find a way to describe what happened in that room and you have found it. The architecture. That is the word. I lived inside an architecture that was built to make certain questions structurally unavailable at certain moments. I understood this at some level while I was inside it. Understanding it did not free me from it. I got out in 1976, 2 years after the announcement, and I have spent every year since asking whether I did enough, whether understanding the architecture and leaving was enough, whether Carol, who understood it and stayed, was more honest than I was. She stayed inside something she understood was built to prevent her from asking certain questions, and she asked the question anyway, how long have you been planning this? And she got the answer that closed the question, and she nodded and stayed. And I left, and she died in Jonestown, and I have thought about that every day for 18 years. Whether leaving was wisdom or whether it was the same thing as not asking the question, whether I got out or whether I just executed a different kind of nod, I do not know. I have not been able to decide. I am not sure the distinction is as clear as I want it to be. The letter is 4 pages. The researcher quotes it in full in an appendix to the paper. It is, in the judgment of every researcher who has read both the paper and the appendix, more important than the paper, because the paper describes the architecture. The letter is someone living inside the description. Someone who understood the architecture, left the architecture, and has spent 18 years in the particular condition of a person who knows what they escaped and does not know whether escaping was the right thing. Who carries Carol's nod and Carol's question and Carol's death and the jungle that Carol went to on the 1974 Tuesday night and the 2 hours of notice and the quiet in the room? Who carries all of it the way that people carry things that the architecture produced in them that leaving the architecture did not remove? Because the architecture does not stay in the building. It stays in the person. It stays in the quiet, in the nod, in the question that was asked once and closed and not asked again, in the recognition, available to everyone in that room on that Tuesday night, available to Garrison and to Carol and to everyone who stayed and everyone who eventually left, that the decision was made, that the direction was set, that the jungle was waiting, and that the question of whether it was right was not the operative question. Not then, not in that room, not inside that architecture. The operative question was what to do now. Garrison left, Carol stayed, 918 people went to Guyana. And the Tuesday night in 1974, when the decision was announced in a room where no one asked whether it was right after Carol's question was closed, is still in the archive, still in Garrison's letter, still in the quiet that followed, the quiet of people who understood, the quiet that was not agreement, the quiet that was the architecture, doing what it was built to do, in the room where Jonestown began, not in Guyana, not in the jungle, in a room in California, at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, in the spring of 1974. When one person asked the only question worth asking and got the answer that closed it and nodded, and the rest of the room was quiet and the architecture held and the jungle was already waiting even though no one had seen it yet, that is where Jonestown began, in the quiet, in the nod,